So welcome. My name is Miriam, and together with my colleague Johannes Fehrle, I want to welcome you on behalf of the Biomaterialities Research Group at Humboldt University in Berlin. This is an event that is part of a series of public lectures entitled High-Tech Valorization of Nature, Reproduction, Technology, and Politics in Green Capitalist Projects. And so in today's event, we will be focusing on technologies in agriculture. And the topic of technologies is a little bit of a tricky one because on the one hand, mainstream environmental politics and their institutions are constantly bombarding us with techno-fixed messages, extolling all the virtues of how new technologies and innovations will solve environmental crisis, whether it be climate, biodiversity, and of course, repeating the old mantra that without such technologies, we cannot feed the world. Many of the political projects, such as the bioeconomy, which is something that we research here in our research group in Germany, are largely characterized by such technological solutions. On the other hand, several utopias, maybe from the left, such as those advanced by the accelerationist movement, also embrace a similar fixation on technologies. And I think that the hope in these techno fixes seems to create a sense of control, and perhaps this allows us to escape asking and answering more difficult questions about the ways in which we need to live, produce, and consume differently for such real transformations to come about. So if we have techno-fiscus at one end of the spectrum, the thing is that at the other end of the spectrum, we have a tendency to also omit the role of technologies altogether when we talk about transformation process. And this is true, I think, in academic debates, but also within social movements. And as far as agricultural transformations go, I think that technologies do get talked about actually, but without designating them as such. So for example, when the food sovereignty movement raises the issue of polyculture farming or peasant seeds, we're actually talking about very old and very powerful technologies. But I think that we seldom couch them in those terms that we think about. These are actually technologies. But why do we insist on couching the debate in terms of technologies? For me, the answer is that talking about technologies gets us talking about the concrete how of transformations. So technologies are on the one hand an explicit invitation to thinking about how, that means like materially, biophysically, how do we want to produce differently? But technologies also embody power. So they're key in thinking about how we want to relate differently to one another. And third, technologies are key mediators in how we relate to the environment. So those are very important reasons why talking about the transformation of society and nature is very difficult without talking about technologies. So in today's event, the question that we want to be discussing with all of you is what technologies do we need as part of emancipatory agricultural transformations in the here and now? And by agricultural transformations, we mean the many transformations towards food sovereignty with all of its elements, including local food production and distribution systems, caring for the land and the water, dignified working conditions, gender equality, among others. And so to discuss today's questions, today's event is organized as follows. We will have two sessions of questions directed to our three speakers, which will our three guests, which we'll introduce in a moment. The first section will focus much more on the role of technologies themselves, and the second one will as well, but we will be focusing more on the political conditions to enable those technological changes happening. And the last half hour of the event, we'll open up to questions from the public. And feel free while we are having the roundtable discussion to write some of your questions in the chat, or you can just feel free to do the old-fashioned raising of your hand during the questions and answers. So now I'll hand it over to Johannes to introduce our three guests.
Thank you, Miriam, and also a very warm welcome from me. So I will, as Miriam mentioned, briefly introduce our three panelists before I hand back over again to Miriam for the first round of questions, and then I'll take the second round, and then it's open to everybody. So I will go alphabetically in the introduction by first name. Our first panelist is Andrea, and she is a member of the Konzeptwerk Neue Ökonomie and was until very recently interim professor at the HBK, the University of Fine Arts in Braunschweig. She has long been involved in the degrowth movement and is very well known to everybody through her research in that area, but she's one of the scholars who manages to actually be a scholar activist, which many aspire to. And one of those ways is through her involvement in the Haus des Wandels, which she also co-founded. In terms of her academic output, she has worked for a number of years on a concept called, which she calls conviviality, and which I'm sure she will talk about later during the event, which is presented in her forthcoming book from Konzeptwerk called Konviviale Technik, empirische Technikethik für eine Postwachstumsgesellschaft. And she has also written with Matthias Schmelzer the book Degrowth / Postwachstum zur Einführung, which I believe is translated in English. I'm not sure.
Yes.
And okay, great. So, and she is also involved with the magazine Oya. Our second panelist is Jasper Bernes. Jasper is the author of The Work of Art in the Age of Deindustrialization and 2 books of poetry. The first is called Stars Down and We Are Nothing and So Can You is the second one. But he's not here as a poet today, as you can imagine, but as a thinker and a writer of some excellent essays on revolutionary strategy and transformation. In particularly, I want to highlight his chapter, The Belly of the Revolution, which you can find for free online in Brent Bellamy and Jeff Diamante's book, Materialism and the Critique of Energy. And if you're interested in more of Jasper's output, he's written quite a number of contributions to the journal Endnotes, which is also an excellent journal, by the way, as well as elsewhere. He teaches at the Department of English at UC Berkeley. Our third panelist is Neth Daño. Neth is a coordinator and Asia director of the Action Group on Erosion Technology and Concentration, or short ETC group. ETC is an international civil society organization that monitors the impact of emerging technologies and corporate strategies on marginalized communities, biodiversity, and food and agriculture. She holds degrees in developmental studies and community development and has extensive experience in development and policy work on agriculture, agricultural biodiversity, biosafety, climate change, and environmental governance in Southeast Asia. She has also worked for a number of years for various UN bodies. Okay, so that's the introduction and the first round of questions. I'll hand back to Miriam.
Okay, thanks, Johannes. Yeah, so we'll start with the first round of questions, and I'll be asking my questions to one of you directly, but really in the spirit of this roundtable, feel free, all of you, to jump in and just get a conversation going. Neth, I wanted to pose the first question to you, because Etc. Group has strongly helped to question the ideological premise that without industrial agriculture, we could not feed the world. ETC has pointed out that small producers actually provide 70% of the food that is eaten worldwide. And I think this is a figure that tends to surprise people. But I think that the key distinction here is always behind this figure is the distinction between producing biomass for industry or for energy or something like that versus production of actual food stuff that gets eaten by people. And so in the connection with technologies, I wanted to ask you if you could give us a sense of the technologies that are actually being used or not being used to produce this 70% of food by small scale producers in non-agriculture or non-agri-food circuits. And this could include a number of technologies, including seeds, the ways crops relate to one another, water, mechanization, any of that. And I suspect that there'll be differences in the North and South, but I wonder if you could give us an idea of the technologies that are producing that 70% of food that gets eaten around the world.
Thank you, Miriam, for leading us to that ETC assertion that at least 70% of the world's population are actually fed by small-scale agriculturists, farmers, peasants, fisher folks, pastoralists, urban gardeners. And we presented the data and also evidences to those in a publication that needs to be updated, by the way. We came out with that, I think, in 2019 or 2018. It's a publication called Who Will Feed Us? And it's been cited many times. And as you said, people might be surprised about the data, but FAO actually pushed it even further by saying that family farms, mostly small farms, by the way, have been feeding 80% of the world's population. So there's actually a number of discussions around that, and us ourselves have been involved in a number of discussions with academics around evidences, and also we welcome, of course, critical views and critical lenses, and we also presented in that publication that most of those technologies that small farmers, fisher folks, artisanal fishers, pastoralists have been using to produce food for at least 70% of the world's population are actually, I wouldn't want to call it low tech, but sadly, that's how they are often described in a very, I would say, misleading way. Like it diminishes the amount of innovation and creativity involved. I've heard this description many times across the UN, government discussions, and even among civil society. When we say low tech, those that actually are not sophisticated in terms of the types of machines that are involved. Like in most cases, it's actually just mainly small mechanized, not even mechanized in some, but manual technologies that are run or managed and controlled manually. And in many description that is described as low tech. But as at ETC, I've actually forwarded the concept of wide tech. We say wide tech, which actually loops in the different kinds of technologies that small farmers use that also could involve some form of mechanization, and also like adaptation or adoption of like quite high-tech technologies, types of technologies. What's very important in wide tech is actually the characteristic of sharing these kinds of technologies and innovations. Like we've been part of some documentation of how sharing of basic technologies could actually lead to further innovations and adaptation of these technologies that actually conform to what the farmers in communities need and what suits the conditions. Like for example, in the past organization that I was part of, like we've been part of exchanges among farmers on involving drum seeder, like very rudimentary technology. It's being used widely in Southeast Asia to seed paddies, rice paddies, in a sort of mechanical way. And we were quite amazed, like just introducing the drum seeder developed by Vietnamese rice farmers, for example, in the Philippines, actually encourage local farmers in the Philippines, in Thailand, and also in Myanmar, for example, to create innovations around drum seeder, using materials, also different size, depending on the size of the farm, also adaptation in terms of usefulness for women, and also even for youth users. So like for us, it's key when you talk of what technologies feed the 70% of the world's population. It's really looping in this wide range of technologies that small-scale farmers and small-scale producers are using, depending on their circumstances, which could be the amount of the size of land that they are tilling, also the resources that are available, and also the support that are given by institutions, whether that's civil society, whether that's formal research institutions, or the government as a whole, for to allow innovations in communities to happen, and to happen in a widespread way. Like Vietnam, for example, is an example where institutions actually, we've seen this, enable farmers not just to share innovations, but also to scale up technologies that work on the ground. And I wouldn't hail the political system that enabled that we are critical of that in many ways, but that political system also enabled a more structured, more institutionalized way of sharing technologies that work at the local level, and also allowing communities to innovate in a way that is supported institutionally. So that's a long answer to your question. So the wide tech is much more than the low tech that are often described that way.
And maybe Neth, I can just piggyback onto that. Would you say that wide tech and high tech are mixing in this type of production? Or is it the case that they really exist and are not mixing so much? I mean, I know, for example, in terms of high tech, there are now many apps that are being pushed on to farmers to use to tell them how to farm and so on, like that. Those kinds of like high technologies making an inroads into wide technologies, or would you say they're still somehow separate? Neth, I think your microphone is still off.
Sorry. I think to an increasing extent, like I could cite two examples. Like there's a case, for example, in Uganda, working with some researchers in Switzerland, are actually using phone, not even smartphone, phone, to aid farmers, to assist farmers to respond to like challenges when it comes to addressing pest infestation, also addressing diseases, not just by like we are actually used to like apps that would take pictures. In their case, they would even just describe, because they don't have the smartphone. The connectivity is not even sufficient to allow them to send pictures. But they adopted, like if you can use even analog phone or the not so smartphone just to describe, and then there's this center that the community actually agreed to breeding and varietal selection curriculum, where it's not just one technician who actually provides the answer to the question of farmers, but really socialize that participatory plant breeding training. So I were actually not really saying that there's no room for high tech. Like wide tech allows that, and the key there is like the decision on how to use it, how to make use and optimize a technology that could be inaccessible, and adapt that to the condition of farmers, whether that's an inavailability of smartphones or lack of connectivity and all that. Key there is the participation of people who will use the technology, and also the decision lies on the people who are going to use the technology and adapt the technology to suit their needs and conditions. So it's not really parachuted from the sky. The second example, it was very recent. I was in a discussion with the head of a cooperative in the Philippines, and they really wanted this idea of online technical assistance and all that. That would allow farmer to just send a question to a central mechanism that would provide answers on what to plant, when to plant, etc. So they actually explored this, and they found out it could be too expensive even to adopt that, even to allow some programmers to do that. And they said that instead of paying for that, they actually just devise their own way to facilitate exchanges among the members of the cooperatives, still using mobile phone, still using some app, but very simple and also very accessible, and would not exclude those who don't have smartphones, who don't have high enough connectivity to be able to connect to that kind of hub. So those are two examples I could give that does not exist from the wide tech. And the key there is that the decision on what technology to use, how to use it, actually depends on the people who are going to use it in the end.
Yeah, thank you. I think since we're already talking about this concept of wide tech, it might be interesting to bring, Andrea, you work with the concept of convivial technologies. And having heard what Neth just said about wide technologies, could you explain a little bit about to us what you define as convivial technologies and why they're important criteria for assessing the, I guess, the emancipatory potential of technologies? Maybe you can connect that also to what you see as an actor in the degrowth movement, what you see there for the role of wide technologies, convivial technologies, but also perhaps high technologies that are more prevalent here in the global north.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, actually, I'm working with the concept of convivial technologies, which goes back to Ivan Illich, which some of you might know. He wrote a lot of interesting texts in the 70s. And I think it means quite a bit a similar thing than what you said, Neth, with wide tech. I think convivial technologies is about accessible technologies that do not harm environment in a certain way, but it's not a green technology, but something that people can handle and use and repair themselves. But it can, of course, include high-tech components. I think there's no such thing as like, say, is just giving people a structured way of thinking of the possibilities of tools they developed. And I can give an example, like when I was doing field research with a lot of different groups developing grassroots technologies, I would say, in different fields. I was also doing with farmers in Germany, and especially with farmers who are organizing in community-supported agriculture. So this means they're not producing for the market, but they are producing for people who share the risk of the farmers and who buy a certain amount of the harvest 1 year in advance. And so if the harvest is bad, like they share the risk, and if it's good, like they get a lot of beans and whatever is there. And so this kind of agriculture is often very diverse. Like people do not only produce one cash crop, but they produce a rich diversity of vegetables, and sometimes also of corn, because of course the people who have their shares in their farm, like the community members, they don't only want to eat beans, but like a lot of different variety of vegetables and stuff. And sometimes they also do cheese or other kinds of dairy products. And for that, it is not suitable like the normal kind of technology you would use for producing for the market. They use like these very big tractors and very specialized combined harvesters and whatever machines. And they are also way too expensive for those farms who are often small. So this is a problem that is existing also in the early industrialized countries like Germany as well. Like for the small farmers, these very massive fossil fueled tech solutions are not easily accessible and do not make sense. And they also drive a lot of farmers into a deep spiral of indebtedness that is not very, not feeling very comfortable, of course. But then on the other hand, I learned that a lot of these community-supported agriculture farmers, they go back to work their land with horses because it's more efficient if you have a small part of land, and the horse is in Middle Europe like a very efficient means of production because it eats the grass that is growing anyways. Of course, it needs a specialized care and so on, but the tractor also needs a lot of care. In addition, it produces fertilizers, which in a crisis like now, where we have a massive crisis of chemical fertilizers all around the world, is also like a very interesting thing. But this working equipment you need for working the land with the horse, it's not produced in industry anymore. Like it used to be produced 100 years ago. There were a lot of factories producing a lot of very good, actually, tools that you could use with the horse. But that was stopped in the 60s, 70s. All these factories in Europe, they got extinct. I don't know. They're not existing anymore. So farmers who want to use that, they have to rebuild it. Like they have to reuse old stuff, which of course is very worn out because it's very, very old. Or they have to like recreate and rebuild it. And there exist now very interesting communities who share the knowledge in how to rebuild, for example, these working horse tools, but also other tools. And I was happy when you mentioned the drum seeder, because I was doing, in my research, I also met drum seeders here in Germany. They were basically for onions and other things they are used. And it's so an efficient machine. It's so great. Like you're 10 times as fast as if you would do it by hand. And it costs nearly nothing because it's a very kind of a simple principle. But of course, it's also involved high tech because it's made of steel in a lot of times, or steel parts are involved. And so you just can't, like, you cannot say all these tools are handcrafted, for example. You cannot draw a line between there's handcrafted tools and there's industrial, are a mix of both. But you can open source the blueprints, how to build them. And this is what farmers do. So for example, Farm is an interesting platform that evolve tools. Or also open source ecology is another platform where people do share these blueprints. And I think these kind of commons, like these internet platforms, this is really an idea of the future because it helps people with skills locally to rebuild and to also adapt to their needs, what they use. And also a bit an elderly platform that I also really appreciate is the Appropedia. And this goes back to the term appropriate technology, which is also used mainly in the 80s. And it was invented in a in the development debate, and was invented against the idea that all kinds of high-tech technologies should be brought to the global south. And the idea was that that's not very intelligent, because if there's not the skills and not the means to repair those tools, it's better to develop on-site appropriate technologies. And then there was also a lot of debate around it because, I mean, there was a lot of people who were saying this is a strange approach, because why should some people in some countries be earning high-tech solutions and others not? And I think this is right, like the critiques is right, but I think we should not draw as a solution that we need like very, very not resilient high-tech solutions everywhere, but that we need appropriate technology everywhere. because in each part of the world, there is technology that is appropriate, and a lot of like these very big monster trucks, they are not appropriate nowhere. And they are like, there's a lot of studies that say they they have a massive impact on the soil quality because they make it too, I'm sorry for my English, but they, like, it's not good for the soil. It's much better if you work it with a horse, for example, because the horse is much lighter than these big, big heavy machines and so on. Yeah, well, where did I go? And so I think talking about the commons, like, is very crucial in thinking about emancipatory technologies for agriculture, but for every branch of production and of living.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you to both of you for already bringing these other dimensions of technology in, whether it's property relations with this issue of the commons, and also, as Neth had said before, that this question about power, that it's really about the decisions in the end of how these technologies are being used by farmers, whether they're appropriate or not. These are also really important dimensions. I wanted to invite Jasper into the conversation. And Jasper, I have a sense, I don't know, I've read this essay of yours, which with Johannes was found very interesting in your writing on this belly of the revolution. You're sort of starting from a different idea. You're sort of taking the idea, if there is a major societal transformation going on, then what would be is this issue of the path dependency of technologies, of the fact that we have a lot of technologies in place and that it's not so easy to get an agricultural transformation going because of the fact that we have a lot of dependencies in the way that food gets produced, in the way the machinery that is out there, the kinds of, I don't know, transportation mechanisms and so on. At the same time, you also make a case in this essay for the fact that if you say that you don't think that maybe technologies are really a starting point for a larger transformation, you think that really societal changes have to come first, and then the transformation in technologies will follow. And so I wonder, what would you say is actually the role of technologies? Wouldn't you say that hearing, hearing right now about the types of already appropriate or different technologies that are already out there and that are being used in agriculture today to produce actually a large amount of the food that we eat, wouldn't you say though that those types of technologies are also very important, and wouldn't you see them also as a starting point for a larger transformation?
Yeah, I do think they're important and moreover, interesting. As I say in that article, if we are going to transform the kind of planetary food system such that it can kind of meet the problems introduced by climate change and capitalism together, that it's going to involve, a kind of mass technological imagination and the kind of work of communist engineering that's going to be involving technology of in many of these kind of low and medium tech solutions. I say precisely that. But I think that one of the things that I try to point out is that with regard to agriculture, we can talk about technology for the production of food, but agriculture is also highly mediated and determined by distribution. And so, when we say 70% of the world's food is produced by small farms, that doesn't really tell us anything about the distribution systems, which are highly technical, and also the processing of that food, which is highly technical, and often things are produced with specific processing and kind of distribution networks in mind. So you could have small farmers, and this is actually how it mostly works, producing for these kinds of vast distributional and circulational monopolies and that process that food. It really doesn't say anything about whether it's industrialized, and as such, like, we're missing a big part of the technological story, and so I think that that's really important. I mean, just to take I mean, I think that the way this works in, in kind of emerging economies in the so-called developing world and periphery is very different in each place and requires so much attention. But just to note how, the agriculture in the United States works. I mean, it's one thing that I point out is that, and this is just true of agriculture in general, there's a limit to the size of a farm, right? And so, for different foods, but farms can only become so large without being, without becoming difficult to manage. And so, today in the United States, most farms are technically family farms, and they're kind of like considered smaller farms, but they're highly capitalized. We're talking millions and millions of dollars of loan and machinery, and they're run and owned by families who may, only be living kind of middle class things, but they produce a lot, and they produce it with incredibly high tech technologies, and they're integrated into these kind of distribution networks of massive corporate distributors and producers of inputs. And so, you could so that number, you could say, oh yeah, they're producing our food, but how is it being produced? It's produced this massive kind of techno system. And then there's these big corporate farms, but actually, those are limited, and they do produce a lot of the total output, but there's been a kind of the average size of farm kind of plateaued, and it's different for different industries. But what that tells you is that capitalism often intervenes in agriculture in the sphere of distribution, and that sort of effects can be really truly pernicious. So I think that's just a thing to keep in mind. And then there's lots of these small farms in the United States that are still around, but they're incredibly marginal in terms of what they produce. They don't produce much of the food eaten in the United States. So there's actually still a lot of smaller farms. Now that could change, but they're usually things where it's like a family holding, somebody still holds on to the farm, and they produce a small amount to be able to keep the farm going, and maybe for their own needs, et cetera, et cetera. And the majority of farms in the United States are of that type, but they don't produce very much of the food eaten here. And that's just to talk about it in the context of the US. So, I think that we just have to be clear about what we're talking about when we talk about technology. I think we can look at technology as a tool, but miss the way in which it's part of these technological ensembles. For instance, a tool may be cool, but what kind of power and energy and infrastructure does it rely on and need? And that's why it's better to think kind of systematically about technologies and about the whole kind of ensemble of the technological system, I believe. So yeah, I think, and of course it depends on what it depends on what your goal is, right? If you're talking about the possibility to improve people's living conditions, sure, obviously, these sorts of interventions and changing the ways things are done and making things less toxic and improving the kind of wealth and livelihood of people. I'm sure there's a number of technological solutions, but I think that they're not adequate to the problems facing us. With kind of combined the meeting of a kind of globalized, highly technologically dependent food system and what climate change will bring. I do not think those technological solutions are adequate to what they may be, but they would require. The technologies certainly exist, but they're not in use because the possibilities for them being put into use don't exist. And so, yeah, it would require a massive kind of social revolution in order to introduce those new technological ways. But it's essentially blocked by the present capitalism. And I think that the story that Andrea tells us is really instructive, right? It's like horses are more useful, but one can find the horse-drawn machinery for them. Capitalism doesn't make that, and I think that's actually a big problem. It's not a problem that can be just easily gotten around by people doing it themselves. People can't make iron in their backyards, and maybe these 3D printers and things like that, may be a possibility. But I do think it just points to what I was saying, is that there's technology is part of an ensemble, a globalized totality of relations, and that blocks that is a fetters upon the introduction of kind of new technological solutions. And technologies themselves are kind of embedded with these social relations, and some technologies kind of block the sort of implementation of others. So certainly, technology as such, kind of emancipated humanity would have at its wealth an incredible number of technologies, some of which have just never been acknowledged. Incredible cultural, there's so much knowledge, and I truly believe that we have the knowledge and the technology available to produce all the food for the world, and much of it will not look what we consider technology. And things like a seed drummer is, good as any other things, and that doesn't mean you can't use, robotic things in maybe some cases or whatever. It's about what works. So yeah, I guess that's my position on these questions.
Okay, thanks a lot. Do either of you want to reply to that directly from your perspectives? Because if not, then I would like to bring in another level, like the state or social relations or things like that. And I'd like to start with the state. So particularly if we take into account, as Jasper argues, logistics and distribution of food, what do you think? Do we need some kind of larger state guaranteed infrastructure for processes such as food distribution? If we imagine a kind of transformation or transition to a system that isn't like the current system, so that's non-capitalist, maybe more convivial, more community-based, whatever you want to call it. Infrastructure is one thing. Secondly, do we need state regulations, guarantees for food sovereignty, rights, standards for working conditions, against toxicity, things like that? Or would you rather be of the opinion that the state, by and large, stands in the way of transitioning or kind of regulating the transition to a more convivial, more care-based way of producing and distributing food? And that goes to all of you, whoever wants to go first.
Well, I would just say that, just to add to that, that I don't think any agriculture in the world survives without state intervention. And I mean, this is true. I mean, at least most agriculture is supported by the state. And this is a fact that capitalism kind of won't acknowledge. But the free market doesn't work with farms, right? Because nature is fundamentally unpredictable, right? And the possibility of ruin exists for every farmer. The state is these kind of systems. It simply can't function without supporting agriculture to some degree, but that's just because and this is the point about technology and farms, is that to use this Marxist concept of real subsumption, which Marx uses to talk about the way that like labor processes are transformed by technology. There's a way in which farms and agriculture and food is resistant to real subsumption. It's difficult to really subsume, and the technological progress in agriculture is very slow, incredibly slow. Those horse-drawn implements were the first like real, industrial stuff to enter, and it wasn't until the 19th century, and in most of the 20th, most of the world, not even until then. So it's very, the technological improvement is, and that's because weather and soil and plants are unpredictable in a way that like chunks of steel and oil are not. And so yeah, the process of farming is really hard. That's why apps are needed. It's very difficult, skilled, and it's incredibly risky. And so the free market has just never really worked. It's only been monopoly state subsidy that agriculture has happened in capitalism, or you just let the peasants be ruined and just, let, so.
Yeah, I completely agree with Jasper. Even those corporations dominate global food and agriculture are lying to themselves if they say it's the free market that enabled them to be the big four or the big six. Like, that's really baloney. Like, if we look, we don't even have to scratch deep into the surface to see that the subsidies provided by governments, the enabling policies, and all these policies that are putting up a lot of really tall barriers for alternative technologies to grow, or even for community efforts to progress, are enabled by state policies and state regulations. Like, we've seen this very dramatically in the Green Revolution, for example. There wouldn't have been a Green Revolution if there were governments that supported this, entwined with political agenda. Like, in my part of the world, in Southeast Asia, that has been a very effective vehicle to quell insurgency, the spread of communism. So it's not a coincidence that governments actually were key in enabling, and even the very existence of the Green Revolution lied in the hands of governments. Governments, not just in the countries where they were operated, but also governments that were intervening, like your government, the US government, for example, at the time. And that's also where
the Green Revolution is in some ways set up by the Marshall Plan. Sorry.
Oh, yes, definitely. And we're also seeing this now in the digital revolution, in agriculture 4.0. There's nothing inevitable there. It becomes inevitable because you have governments backed by corporate interest. Actually, like, it's just like the two of them, the dual-headed monster, going together and advancing the digital revolution and conditioning our mind that this is inevitable. But if you come to look at it, there's nothing inevitable there. Like, because you have to put in investments on connectivity to be able to connect everyone and be able to use high-tech apps and fly these drones and all these sensors and all that. And you need to have regulations that would incentivize startups, and also disincentivize people from going the other way. To me, like, that is really very, very clear, and it's really a whole, like, hypocrisy to say that it's the open market. It's really the free market that enabled all these monsters to grow as big as they are now.
I think I completely agree with you that the state or the capitalist state has kind of gotten us into this mess. My question was directed more at, is the state useful to get us out of the mess, or in which ways?
Yeah, I think that's the flip side of that, because, like, just to cite examples, not even as high tech as digital agriculture, like the promotion of monster trucks, the combines that Andrea was describing, because the market for monster trucks for combines in the north has already been saturated. So it's natural to bring this to developing countries. You bring this in a situation where there are tiny farms where your machines are even bigger than the farms. Like, if you're talking of Vietnam, for example, 1/4 of a hectare, like, no farmer would go that way because it's just not practical. It's ridiculous. But then if you have governments that would pump in billions, like in the case of the Philippines, just so cooperatives can get a hold of the combines that the government will even allow to be imported free of taxes. So that is really a big obstacle for farmers to innovate in smaller farms, because, of course, with incentives, it's almost free. Why wouldn't you grab that? So that actually disincentivizes creativity or innovation among farmers. If you flip that, like, really, like, allow all these resources to be able to support innovation, or even this simple thing like support for fabrication, for example. Because Andrea was talking about complete disappearance of small companies that used to produce small machines for horse-drawn technologies and all that. Like in Southeast Asia, there's almost no company now that produce small machines because the governments want them to just import from Kubota, from Japan, or from John Deere and all that. No, like imagine if you flip that and put that resource that instead of importing, why don't you support existing innovators who actually could fabricate or reverse engineer even, or to produce technologies that are more appropriate for small farms that would not require too much dependence on fossil fuel, that would actually support further innovation, that something that will not lock in farmers into technologies that would let them buy forever and ever, including spare parts and all that. So my answer to your question is yes, if you flip that around, but we don't see any, like in my part of the world, unfortunately, I don't see any opening towards that direction right now. Maybe perhaps Vietnam, because of that political institution that exists there. Yeah, I see that actually happening in some ways there, but not necessarily in a scale that would make a difference beyond Vietnam. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree to what you said. Also in the European Union, the subsidies for the farmings, they are all like, there's a small percentage for organic farmings, but also that is kind of all is directed towards farms being bigger and bigger and bigger and more industrialized. Like that's the goal of all these subsidies. But I think there might be like some chances still, as I think the state is not a black box. I mean, there is not existing such a thing like the state, but it's composed like of a lot of human beings in a lot of bureaucracies, like doing bureaucratic stuff. And then there's also the politicians in the parliaments doing the political stuff. And there's always the possibility of having some cracks in that. Like there is always people who maybe by chance sit in some local bureaucracies, especially, and they really want to support other ways. And they find ways to help and support like small scale farming, like things like community supported agriculture or other things. And I think it's very important to somehow think about intelligent interface design. I would call it, like I'm in a kind of a research project since a year where we research interface design between projects following an alternative logic and alternative economy and like also other technologies and state bureaucracies, because we are all subject to these laws in the countries where we are in. And these laws, they are at the end supported by physical violence if we don't accord to these laws. Like everywhere where there is a functioning state, it's backed by physical violence in the end. So we have to somehow arrange with what is happening there. But I think it is totally possible collectively in widening rooms, and we call that in the degrowth discussion now utopias, like rooms where we try to do it differently, but then it's all a question of doing this intelligent interface design of, for example, getting some subsidies by explaining to local bureaucracies or authorities what we are doing in words they can understand. And then also like to take those subsidies and slightly do a bit of other things than what we said we would do. And I mean, we all know these kind of tactics. And I think it's important that maybe also between countries or different parts of the world, we exchange about how we do this, because this is very site-specific knowledge. I think this kind of interface design, it works differently in the US, it might work differently in the Philippines or in Vietnam or in Germany, because it's very much related to the local laws and how they function, and the local bureaucracies and how they function. But the thing itself, like, it's a necessity everywhere. And I don't see that as a leftist, progressive people whatsoever. We do have a big majority for having now a big revolution tomorrow or day after tomorrow. And I'm not even sure like what that would look like. But still, I think it's necessary to broaden these spaces where we can try out the new things. And not like being too much blocked by the imaginary of the state as a monolith.
Yeah, I completely agree with Andrea. No, looking at the state as not as a homogeneous monolith, I think offers you some opportunities to make difference to some extent. I would say I emphasize to some extent, because like we've had a number of experiences like this in the Philippines and across Southeast Asia, where you have local governments themselves, no, like deciding that they will have an ordinance declaring the whole province as organic or supporting small-scale agriculture. The main limitation, of course, is much of this is reliant on progressive individuals. They may not be leftists, they may not be radicals, but they share that kind of vision. So, and they're also, of course, limited by the political system, you know, like in the case of the Philippines, they could only just be there for 3 years, because that's the term for local government. And in most cases, it's actually their progressive moves and actions that actually cost them their re-election in many cases, unfortunately. So it's really limited by that kind of the political realities. And we've had our ups and downs on dealing with this, like progressive local officials or progressive legislators. We even managed at some point in 2010 to have an organic agriculture law in the Philippines, which was mangled beyond recognition when it went to Congress. So you actually have big fertilizer companies taking advantage of producing biological fertilizers, you know, like this. So I think yes, I agree. There are opportunities offered by looking at possibilities at different levels or different sections of the governments, but we also have to realize that there are institutional, even structural limitations that could limit that opportunity as well. Yeah.
Yes, I totally agree.
Thanks a lot. Given the time, I do have tons more questions, but I would actually like to hand over to the audience already. And we had one first question by Lucas, which is in the chat. And the effect of that question is, what would you say about who or what is needed to tackle the challenge of climate change if state and industry are a two-headed monster? Very short, but very complex question.
Is that question addressed to me?
I think it's addressed to everybody.
Yeah.
But and I would like everybody's opinion, because I would imagine that from a practical perspective, you're all working towards a similar goal, perhaps, but in very different ways. Yeah, why don't you go first, Neth?
Me? to me, like the real solutions to the climate crisis definitely does not lie in the hands of industry, which could be faulted for most of it, the crisis that we're facing, and of course, definitely not in the hands of the state. But of course, as we are mentioning here, a lot of the regulations, a lot of the political will would also come from the state, no, and that's the reality. And our knee-jerk reaction would always be that it lies in the hands of people, no. But then, what the kind of thinking that many people across the world, like particularly the helplessness in the face of the gravity and urgency of the situation, pushes us to the direction of defaulting this in the hands of governments, which is really unfortunate. And we've seen this how it has been quite very ineffective, like at the intergovernmental level. I still I still have a lot of optimism that it's actually the movement of people that would really bring us to solution to address the climate crisis. And through the years, there's been movements that have been calling for, would claim to have like the real solutions that are barely heard. Now, because like what we are hearing are actually those solutions that, as Miriam started the conversation, that would actually bring us towards the fixation with technology. You know, like it's really a good, I would say, a good escape route, no, for many governments to look at technology as the way out of this problem. And like unpacking that has not been easy, because I think the gravity of the problem also somehow lead people to helplessness, that maybe, technology is the only way for to bring us out of this. And there hasn't been really any space or even capacity, I would even say, to unpack the reality behind, you know, the technological fixation. And to me, the sad reality is that the more we try to unpack the reality behind technological fixation, the more people retreat to a default that technology is something for experts to discuss. You know, like we are here discussing ways of like the role of technology towards transformation. But in many spaces, as Miriam mentioned at the beginning, those who are involved in technological solution, whether that's for the agricultural or biodiversity or climate crisis, are not even aware or don't even label their work as technological. You know, like, and on the other hand, you have those so-called experts, mostly corporate experts, that the technology is something for experts to discuss. So there is this really polls that would actually tend to disempower those people who should be at the center of solutions. So this has not been an easy problematic, and I think made even more difficult by the fact that the crisis that we are facing, biodiversity, climate, environmental, have reached a level of an emergency. You know, like and that emergency level pushes us even more to technological fixation. So it's really like a loop like that. I wouldn't really give in to that, and I really hope, no, that the movements led by people who are offering solutions that come from the ground will continue pushing on, and somehow we will get there in terms of being heard and being really recognized as the central part of addressing this crisis. Yeah, that's my take.
Thanks a lot, Andrea. Jasper, do you have something to add? I'm sure you do.
Well, the question is rather large. I mean, it really depends on what the objective is, talking about what the state can do. Certainly the state can do lots of things, but whether it can kind of, decarbonize agriculture and produce healthy and abundant and plentiful food for all the hungry people in the world, no, I don't think it can do that. I don't think it will. It might introduce some reforms that improve, some portion of people's lives, but it's not, the pressure of the international market is going to, ensure that even states that try something pretty radical are going to be kind of, pushed back unless they have, unless they go further. And I think we see this breaking free from the kind of technological system that the kind of international conglomerates have set up will not be easy. And a lot of it has to do with energy and oil and distribution. So yeah, I think the state is, I think the state largely, that states compete with each other, and they serve as kind of national blocks of capital on the world market. And that's pretty much how they operate with each other with regard to their agriculture. That's how it's been done for a long time. And that whole system is to the detriment of, everyone. I think, the example of what a state can do, I think the story of the Ukraine war and the story that the Ukraine war has uncovered around agriculture in Russia and Ukraine is quite fascinating. Because the region of the Ukraine and the region of Russia near it, has been a center of agricultural production and grain production since the time of the Greeks. They had colonies there to make that Athens was fed by grain that came across the Black Sea, and but what's happened in the last 30 years in the region is so significant that it's really it gives this war its current character, right? So Putin, as a response to the sort of famine and hunger crisis that confronted Russia in the 90s, one of his key policies was to make sure that they had a grain surplus and invested in the most kind of high-tech grain agriculture in the producing regions, which are quite capable of producing a lot of grain. But it periodically, when the Soviet Union had problems with famines in that region too, so it kind of fluctuates. But the result has been that that Russia now is food sovereign to some degree. That's part of what allows it to conduct its war. It's not as affected by the international embargoes, and then the Ukraine, which had been producing a lot of wheat, has shifted over to producing seed oil and corn, which meant that the war hasn't been as bad on people who depended upon Ukrainian grain as would have been thought. And then the Russian grain farms had such a good year that even just with most of the grain still stuck in Ukrainian ports, there was Egypt and these countries that were looking at massive food crises because of this, and been sort of spared from that. So I don't know. When I look at what states do with agriculture, I don't see anything very pretty, and it's sort of become this way to compete. So and the orientation towards export, cash export products is really difficult to get around. Here in California, I think about what we would do with the land around us, and California is incredibly fertile and productive, but most of the farms have been oriented towards this kind of high value produce because labor is so expensive here relative. So what gets produced in California, products like wine or nuts, and these are the things that are industrialized on site. So it's like the farm is a factory, and there's highly capital intensive things, but that's not what people will need. You know, if we wanted to reorganize the food system, in fact, we have these orchards that are just producing tons of nuts. And I mean, I love nuts, but you know, California supplies nuts for the entire world. And you know, it's to take this land, you know, and to make it oriented towards nuts and wine. That's what the market does, and that's a hard problem to get around. That has to do with the planting of, you know, trees. It's going to take, it's a generational process of reaching that, and I can't see a state allowing that remaking. They will, you know, fight it. So at least the state we have in the United States.
Andrea, do you want to add something?
I mean, I can say some things about maybe climate crisis and multiple crises. I was recently invited on a panel on some other topic with Craig Calhoun, who is a world system theoretician, and he wrote a book with Immanuel Wallerstein, I think 10 years ago or something, Has Capitalism a Future? And then like aside from the panel, I was asking him, because I thought, okay, well, he's like 65 and he's working on that issues for 45 years now. He must know. What do you think about the modern world system? Is it collapsing right now? And he said blankly, yes, I think it does. And I was like, oh, well, that's interesting. I mean, it feels like it does, but that's interesting that somebody who's analyzing the modern world system for lots of years also thinks it does. And I think it's not quite clear what that means. I mean, we can see that all kinds of balances in all, like in international relations, and also inside a lot of national states, and a lot of things get very destabilized, and things get very less predictable. And like the climate crisis, I think, is a very big, like adding a lot of this unpredictable, you know what I mean, to all these kinds of developments. And so, for example, we experience in Europe, but I think also in the world market, like a price explosion of chemical fertilizers, for example. Like it's really an explosion. It's like not doubling, it's like the hundredth or something than it was like some years ago. It's really incredible. And it's not affordable for a lot of farmers. It will not be affordable in the next year to have the same amount of chemical fertilizers than they used to have. And I mean, this is really a threat to industrial agriculture. And I don't think that this crisis will go away very quickly, because it is coupled with the Ukraine war and with the gas price and with all this energy crisis that will not soon be solved. And so I think, as we don't see, as Neth said, like on an international level, like really action against the climate crisis, but we see a lot of very destabilized systems, like crumbling at one end and then becoming authoritarian at the other end, and you know, like all these kinds of developments that are not linear, but intervene into each other, and there opens up all the time certain windows of possibilities. But I feel it's important to be prepared to these kind of windows of opportunities, and to in local processes, sometimes in national processes, sometimes in like European, or I don't know, like bigger processes, to take these possibilities where we see them, and to build alliances with people inside bureaucracies or inside governments, because a lot of these functional elites, and also a lot of the politicians, they are very helpless at the moment. I mean, when we talk to them, a lot of them, they are saying like, oh, I don't know what to do. Like they're really overwhelmed by the pandemics, by the war, by the climate crisis. I think it's much less than, for example, with the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, where a lot of politicians had the impression that they had the recipes to overcome it. And we're quite self-assured that we will overcome this with this kind and that kind of neoliberal recipes, etc. Blah blah. And I think, like a lot of people in governments and in bureaucracies, they are very less sure of what to do now. And this can also be a possibility, but also like for the good and for the bad, as we see in the repowering of a lot of neo-fascist and authoritarian.
Just quickly, we are almost out of time, but I'm fine running 5 or 10 minutes longer, but I do want to give the audience a final chance for sure to say something. So if you want to ask Andrea or Neth or Jasper or all of them a question, then now's your time to raise your hand. And yeah, I guess in the meantime, Jasper, if you wanted to respond, I didn't want to cut you off.
Oh, I mean, I don't want to make it sound as if you know, movements that capture a state are incapable of, you know, producing reforms, and that there aren't sympathetic people with the state that might, you know, push things in the direction of a kind of, you know, convivial, the introduction of convivial technologies, which I support and I want to see proliferate. It's just that what I understand the relationship between state and capital to be is that, you know, these states that, you know, they are in crisis, but confronting this inflation crisis, their desire is to get food costs down fundamentally. And the project of kind of reforming the food system and introducing convivial technologies is going to be at odds with that. There is no way to, you know, to introduce this and get food cheaper or compete with industrial agriculture to produce cheap food. I mean, food is too cheap as it is in a lot of the world, and that's because of the energy content, and you know, humans are going to have to spend a lot more of their time producing food. And so I think the expectation of the kind of incredible cheapness of food that's existed, which is connected to the cheap energy system, is just, you know, it's incompatible with the realities. But the pressure to the political pressure on states to keep grocery bills low is, you know, it's not going to lead towards the introduction of convivial technology. I mean, it might lead to the introduction of kind of reforms that are helpful for it, but I think that, you know, and I do, you know, I think the fertilizers are coming back, and I think that we have to be aware of the kind of boom bust cycle in the petroleum industry, which is going to, you know, lead to this, you know, these fire sales later on. And already the kind of shipping container, you know, prices are going down, and we shouldn't get blindsided by this kind of moment when suddenly, you know, energy is cheap again. And, you know, and I think in Europe it's more complicated and different country by country, but overall, you think to deflate food is going to be like significant, and I think that despite the inflation, that we still have a lot of deflationary pressure in the world because labor is cheap, and I think that will ultimately that our era will be ultimately one of deflation, not inflation, because of just the fact there's so much labor out there. And
I mean, I could answer to that second question of Lucas if you want in the chat.
Go ahead.
Sure.
It's a question about scaling up. And like when you're talking about the commons, you always get the question about scaling up. And actually, I don't want to answer that question by, oh yes, we will scale up in this or that way. And because I don't think it's so much about like the implementation of convenient technologies or something from above. I think it's about like these spaces I mentioned before. I think it's about people who just take their agency and do things, and for example build like a cool kind of drum cedar or something else. And I think it's more a movement of desertation, maybe. And I really believe in desertation, actually, because I think it's a good thing to do. Like, I was at a debate of eco-socialist futures like a month ago, I think, and somebody told me like this famous citation by Marxist researcher Jodie Dean, and she said Goldman Sachs doesn't care if you raise chickens, because like her intent was you should like change the bigger structures all the way down. And maybe I misunderstood the citation, but I think it's a bit the same question, like questioning scale, you know, like it's a good thing in itself if you're not maybe vegan to raise chickens, because then you can feed your children and the children of your friends, and you have eggs and whatever. And then the question is more about networking, like networking with other people who do other kinds of vegetables, and networking with other people who do produce some kinds of appropriate convivial white whatever tools to produce that kind of food. And it's also a shift in our imagination, like not to continue the kind of bourgeois capitalist war on subsistence, like Ivan Illich named it, to think that subsistence work and agricultural work and care work, this also has a very gender dimension, is a bad thing in itself, but to shift the perspective all the way and look at all the people who are doing this care work, this subsistence work, and acknowledge that it's so important and that it's actually feeding the world, as Neth said at the beginning. Like that's what people eat, and what people live off is the care work and the subsistence work of a lot of people. And this is very, very important. And maybe we should shift our focus a bit away from always staring at the state and the big scale and the big industries. And of course they do matter because they intervene with our lives if we want or not. But they do not grab everything, and they do not colonize everything. There is space to live other ways and to connect with other people all around the globe. And we should not let us take away this space. That's what I think on it.
Well, thank you, Andrea. In a way, I think those were very nice words to finish off actually the panel, a very nice message to take away. And I actually think that this was a very nice discussion because we got to really naming a lot of different elements that made this discussion on technologies more nuanced, you know, where it was the kind of things that got mentioned, like what Neth was saying, this need to name technologies that are also appropriate, or why technologies are these kinds of things, and to reappropriate this discourse about the techno-fixation to say, okay, but what is technologies more wider? The things that got mentioned about interface design and the need to communicate those, you know, beyond borders, beyond across different countries. Even this interesting thing that you brought up, Andrea, also about alliances with the state, you know, pointing out these spaces that maybe there are bureaucrats and state bureaucracies that are sort of helpless, and that there's also cracks there to be pushed on. And this thing, this last point about not everything being, you know, colonized entirely, but there is lots of spaces to make new room. So I really appreciate this conversation, and it's only It's part of a conversation that we want to keep going. We've envisioned this, either as a public lecture. Some of the upcoming events that we're hosting are really one person giving a kind of a lecture. And I actually want to point those out for people who want to join us next time. So on November 16, we'll be hosting the next event with Naomi Milner from the Department of Geography at the University of Bristol. And we will be exploring with her the role of drones in forest conservation and this ambiguity of how drones can be used both as a means of exercising control, but also as a subversive practice to regain territorial autonomy. That is on November 16th. And then on November 28th, we'll be hosting Kelly Bronson from the University of Ottawa, who's going to talk about her new book, which is called The Immaculate Conception of Data. And the book deals with the legal agreements surrounding agricultural big data to trace how it is used, with what consequences, especially how these new data power fit into pre-existing arrangement in agricultural oligopolies. So we look forward to keeping on this discussion about technology, especially in the context of agriculture, forestry, and what we in Germany, what is being termed the bioeconomy. And yes, as Johannes just posted in the chat, the announcements and for those other events can be found at Biomaterialities DE, which is the website of the project where we work. And I really want to thank Andrea, Neth, and Jasper for taking the time being here with us today and having this conversation. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much for all of you who are here in the audience. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you next time.